Thanks so much everyone for watching. We've got an epic lineup tonight of speakers. We've got an awesome panel here. Amazing group of functional doctors, technology, activists for a leap forward in medicine.
You know, our goal is to make it easy for practitioners to learn in community.
This ecosystem that is being set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network, and it all revolves around you.
Welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Please welcome your host, James Maskell.
Hello and welcome to the Functional Forum. We are here in Chicago for the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute's annual conference, and the theme this year is Cardiometabolic Function. Over the next hour you're going to hear from some of the best presenters and some of the attendees who showed up to the event. Really powerful, bringing together community to talk about the most important topic in medicine. Enjoy. So first up, we have Dr. Austin Perlmutter for the first time on the Functional Forum. He kicked off the conference with a great talk, and here's a little interview we did before his segment. Enjoy. All right, we are here with Dr. Austin Perlmutter, who just kicked off the conference. And Doc, really great to have you here on the Functional Forum for the first time. Yeah, been wanting to have you here on the show. You kicked off the conference. It's a cardiometabolic conference, but yet you spent a lot of time talking about brain health and immunity and adiposity. Why are all these topics relevant, and why did you choose to kick it off in that way?
You know, I think there's this first thing we have to challenge, which is the idea that these systems are somehow separate. That you have metabolic health over in one bucket, immune health over here, neurological health, and that these systems are not intertwined in constant communication. For the most part, the way that we learn about metabolic function in medical school and in training is something along the lines of what we usually think about as metabolic syndrome. So certainly we think about cardiometabolic function, the health of our heart, the health of our blood vessels is a key component of that. You might push it a little bit further and say, well, stroke, okay, so that's getting to the brain. But we also think about things like diabetes and other kind of overt metabolic dysfunctional states related to insulin and glucose metabolism, diabetes being the prototypical form, as the main conversation that we need to have around metabolic health. What I wanted to bring up is that as you look at these systems and where they intertwine, you can push the boundaries of where metabolism lives. And similarly, you can push the boundaries of its significance as far as understanding why, for the average person, metabolic health isn't just about the levels of glucose in their bloodstream. And one of the points that I made early on is that we have this understanding of how our metabolism shapes our brain function. And it comes up in the form of those advertisements you see, or when you feel hangry. Yeah. You feel, oh, it's my blood sugar going low. Mm-hmm. Now, it may or may not be that your blood sugar is actually going low that is causing a person to feel these things. It could be something like ghrelin, which is a hormone produced in the GI tract that can make people feel hungry. But the point is, we know that our metabolic state influences our brain process. Yeah. And that starts to give us the understanding of, hey, if we know that what's happening with our metabolism is influencing our brain, to what extent is that happening? And what are maybe some disease outcomes that we could start making more concrete tethers between what we put into our bodies, what we eat, how we regulate metabolism through things like stress mitigation and exercise, and our brain state, both right now as far as how we're thinking and our risk for conditions like depression and Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. Well, I know obviously you have a lot of family history with brain health and obviously connected to, metabolic conditions as you just mentioned, but I know you're working all day, every day on immunity as sort of a conversation. Over the last year, post-COVID, we've certainly seen all this research coming out about how this sort of fundamental bottom of the matrix functional medicine, lifestyle medicine stuff, really affects our immunity. How does that all, to play into that conversation, and why is it critical for, people on the front line to see those connections?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most consistent statistics we saw coming out of the pandemic is that people who were hospitalized with evidence of metabolic dysfunction, so elevated blood sugar, for example, were at dramatically higher risk of having complications from COVID, death and significant disability, worse outcomes from the disease. Yeah. We also know that translates over to people with a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So there is something happening we have an immune issue, which is a viral infection that is being played upon the underlying metabolic dysfunction. I mean, it speaks to a fundamental truth, which is COVID disproportionately affected people based on their core baseline health metrics, right? It wasn't just a unifying, it affected everyone the same way. Similarly, we see that people who are at the edges of the spectrum for age, the elderly, tended to be disproportionately affected negatively by COVID. One of the reasons for that is because we know that the immune system changes as we age, that as we age, our immune cells tend to get a little bit more rigid, a little bit less able to respond to new threats. And so you layer in this threat, which is a viral infection, and it seemed that that may be one of the variables that actually predispose people to worse outcomes. But one other thing I'll say here, which is I think a really important point for people to understand as it relates to brain health conditions. So the examples I brought up were really Alzheimer's and depression. Alzheimer's affecting about, as the most common form of dementia, which affects about 55 million people, projected to affect around 150 million people in the coming years of all forms of dementia. Again, the most common cause being Alzheimer's. And depression, which is affecting hundreds of millions of people around the world, that we're trying to get beyond the idea that these incredibly prevalent conditions are driven by one variable. So in the context of depression, it's not just serotonin at play. In the context of Alzheimer's, it's not just amyloid buildup at play. And so if you say, well, there's more going on, then you ask, what's actually in the brain? And something that very few people understand is by cell number, about 50% of our cells in our brain are actually glial cells, not neurons. They're these helper type cells that perform a variety of function. Total cells in the brain, about 10%, so a big chunk of those glial cells are called microglial cells. They're immune cells. And they're kind of the ones responsible for, is your brain in an inflammatory state, an anti-inflammatory state? Is it reacting the right way to the environment? Is it overreacting? And research finds pretty consistently that microglial health is linked to rates of depression, is linked to rates of Alzheimer's disease. So that's a lot to think about. But here's the integration. These microglial cells form a net across the entirety of your brain. And they have all these arms and they're out there looking for signals, both good and bad signals. They're just tasked with basically understanding what is happening in the environment and responding to it. So if there's a scenario where a virus gets into the brain or where some other inflammatory molecule gets into the brain, they react by saying, we need to deal with this. We need to upregulate inflammation to fight off this bug. In other scenarios, they actually go the opposite direction. So when they get the right signals, something maybe like an omega-3, they might say, now it's time to resolve, it's time to help heal. So some of the core signals that teach the microglial cells which way they're going to go are actually metabolic signals. So we know that all these variables, for example, blood glucose, uric acid levels, dietary components like polyphenols, levels of energy like ATP, as well as growth factors like insulin, like growth factor 1, all inform these microglial cells as to what they should do next. So to put this into context here, because I know we're trying to pull a lot of strings, first of all, understanding that today in the modern day, the majority of our diseases by deaths are chronic and largely preventable diseases with at least a substantial element of metabolic dysfunction. As it relates to the brain, one of the main ways in which higher rates of metabolic dysfunction, things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, may actually translate over to higher risk for dementia, depression, is through these microglial cells, which are immune cells. So it's both the metabolic system teaching the immune system and vice versa that we need to pay attention to. You can't just pull out one string without untangling the whole ball.
And that's why this functional medicine education is going to be so critical for the future of medicine, because it is a complex thing.
It is a complex thing. And there's pros and cons to that. The pro side is you're actually looking at reality. You're not deluding yourself into saying, now I get it. It's serotonin for depression. If I give a drug that increases serotonin, that will work in 100% of people. That's obviously not the case. The con side of it is it's complicated.
It's complicated.
But so is life. And the idea that we would assume somehow the brain exists outside of complexity, that we should be able to do quick fixes for our brain health, when literally right now you have billions of brain cells with trillions of connections between them, is ludicrous.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one last point I want to ask you, because you're obviously at the beginning of your career and taking functional medicine forward in your own, in your own way, and you've chosen at the beginning to work really closely with Dr. Bland, and obviously this is his conference, and we've been coming here for a number of years reporting on this because he's always on the cutting edge. why did you choose to, start your career working so closely with Jeff, and what's it been like?
Yeah, well, so for people who don't know, I've been working with Jeff for the last few years in the company called Big Bold Health, which I know you've been involved with. And the cornerstone of this is to try to translate the current science in immune health into helping people to solve a number of health-related issues, helping them to think better, helping them to overall feel better. Jeff, or Dr. Bland, has been in this industry for some time. And so I benefit tremendously from his expertise, not just in the science, which is really impressive. I mean, the man is a walking encyclopedia, but also his understanding of how things are peaks and valleys that seem so significant to a person like me who is early on, but to him it's nothing. It's not a real thing. And so the goal here that he's proposed is, we need to be focused on what really matters, and we need to not be dissuaded by the fact that there are these, all of these opportunities for, I guess, distraction, but also to take our eyes off the ball. And so he always comes back to the science and how do we translate that science into something that improves a person's functional health.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a scientific education. Every interaction with him is like reading from a medical textbook, and sometimes it is verbatim, him translating from a medical textbook. But a lot of it is too just the feeling I get of being around somebody who has so consistently committed himself to elevating human health beyond all the hype, beyond all the sensationalism, and trying to get to exactly what we've said, which is the reality of these biological systems, which are very nuanced, very complex, but when understood, allow people to feel empowered that they can change their health and have the tools necessary to make that happen.
Great. Well, I'm grateful that you're taking this on and bringing all that information and finding ways to contextualize it for our audience, and then for the greater population that obviously are the end user of this information. So Dr. Perlmutter gave a really powerful introduction and initial lecture at the conference. Here are some of the best bits. Enjoy.
When we think about what it is that drives health, when we think about what it is that drives quality of life, it's really your moment-to-moment brain function. Now, we talk a lot about what's going to happen 30 years from now. You don't want to develop a heart attack. You don't want a stroke. You don't want to develop Alzheimer's disease. Those things are the long-term reflection of your thinking now. And I don't really hear from people that they're doing their best to optimize their brain thinking function now. I mean, I do say, sure, you take some coffee. There's some people out there looking at nootropics. But if you really ask yourself, what is your brain biology doing right now? And if we were to look at this from the perspective of the way people look at cardiac disease prevention and say, oh, I'm doing something today to prevent my risk for developing a heart attack in 10 years. Nobody does this as it relates to brain function. And certainly nobody does this as it would be to say, I want good brain function tomorrow. What can I do today that will optimize my cognition tomorrow? Yet this is arguably the most important thing because it's actually our quality of life and how we think. So when we think about frameworks around decision making, why it is that you make one decision over another decision? I mean, I'm super biased because I care a lot, but when you have somebody sitting in the clinic, somebody's talking about, I'm just having trouble following through with your plan. Whether it's taking antihypertensive medication or exercising or eating a Mediterranean pattern diet, you don't really say, well, let's talk about the reasons, or maybe you do, in which case, amazing, but you don't talk about the reasons why a person's brain will or will not let them make those good choices. Usually, when we think about this, and I mean we meaning clinicians in addition to the general public, we think about these psychological constructs as being the most important variables as to why somebody does or doesn't do something. So if you've read Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow, you'll know about this System 1 and System 2. It's a good representation of the idea that there are two systems within the brain. One is kind of fast, impulsive, quick. The other one is more reflective. And in general, unless you're being chased by, choose your prehistoric creature, the saber-toothed bear, cat, dog, for most of us, unless we're being chased by some sort of predator, unless we're in immediate risk to life and limb, we are not going to be wanting to over-rely on this quick, impulsive thinking, right? Instead, we want to be reflective. This is where System 2 comes in. And so Daniel Kahneman talks about this in detail in the idea that there are certain things that if we make more reflective, we tend to benefit. That leads us to this idea of willpower, which is still the fundamental tenet of how people approach decision making. If you want to do things in a healthier way, have more willpower. Just find it. You go to the willpower store, get some more of it, and if you don't get it, you're kind of a bad person because you don't have the strength, the fortitude to do what is necessary to be healthy. These are psychological constructs, and they have to be based in biology. And this is where I think we have to go, which is the idea of what is our biology driving our brain state and decision making. So in Brainwash, which I wrote with my dad, we talk about the prefrontal cortex versus the limbic system and how activation of the prefrontal cortex is probably about the most powerful thing that we can do to encourage positive decision making, both in ourselves and in patients. We also know that the functional connectivity of our brains predicts our decision making. So based on whether parts of your brain are speaking to each other, you can predict whether a person will make a more impulsive choice or a more measured choice. And there are things that we can do. I should also mention there are interventions that are both drug-based and therapeutic, like you can do certain forms of MRI, certain forms of intervention on the brain that will actually allow you to bias these systems. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, not MRI. But the other point that I think is important to make is that biological systems, including the immune system and the metabolic system, will enable you to bias a brain towards better decisions or worse decisions. And this is very recent stuff, so you're going to hear it here hopefully for the first time, hopefully not for the last time. This is looking at how blood glucose levels influence decision making. So we're not talking here about your risk for developing Alzheimer's in 10 years. We're talking about basically what are your blood sugar levels today tell you about the decisions that you're going to make. And what they show here is that in this meta-analysis, people who have lower blood sugar levels tend to make more risky decisions around food. Now, that probably makes sense to a lot of you. This is the idea of being hangry. You know, there's a reason that those commercials tell you to reach for your candy bar when you're hungry, as opposed to when you're hungry, go back home, make a bowl of quinoa and a kale salad and prepare a well-seasoned steak. You don't have time, nor do you care. You're impulsive. You need that quick fix. But we don't necessarily factor this into the idea that our decisions are moment-to-moment biased by our brain's metabolic state. And this is some more recent research. This is looking at how day-long cognitive work alters the control of economic decisions. I don't imagine there'll be a whole lot of conversation in the next couple days on neuroeconomics, but it's the idea that our neuronal setup is going to bias us towards certain patterns of decision making. Whatever you do in your lives, if you're seeing patients, if you're investing in the stock market, if you're spending time with your friends and family and trying to figure out where do I spend my time, your decisions really do matter. Your decisions are the single biggest predictor of what outcomes you will experience in life. So finding ways to understand why you make certain types of decisions over others is really important. This research starts to get at one of the core mechanisms of why we may make certain types of decisions. So they used magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and they looked at brain metabolites over the course of a day. They had one group, which is definitely the worst group to be in, do a whole bunch of tasks. So do a whole bunch of complex math solving, basically a lot of problem solving that exhausted their mental reserves. A day of testing. The other group got it easy. They just were able to kind of hang out, answer some questions, and more or less coast through the day. And what they showed is the people who had to think a lot tended to make more impulsive choices. We all psychologically understand what I'm saying here, right? You've experienced the full day of work, and you come home, you're probably not as likely to do something really great for your health as you would be if you had a more relaxed day and you were feeling really cognitively well. You know, there's a reason you reach for that bag of chips when you get home after the stressful day, as opposed to saying, you know, the next best thing is to do an hour of meditation, for most people. Maybe you're the exception. So what they showed here is, again, not surprising. When people had to use their brains a lot, they tended to afterwards make more impulsive choices. But what was really interesting here is when they looked at glutamate levels within the brain, they showed an accumulation of this molecule within the lateral prefrontal cortex compared to the people who didn't have to think all that well. The researchers say that this supports a neurometabolic model in which glutamate accumulation triggers a regulatory mechanism that makes the lateral prefrontal cortex activation more costly, explaining why cognitive control is harder to mobilize after a strenuous workday. that's a lot of words. It seems complicated. But realize what we're talking about right now is a metabolic architecture that explains why people make the choices they do. This gets kind of close to home because, to me, a lot of people want to hold back on understanding this because why you choose something, why you think something, why you behave in a certain way feels like the you. That's the identity. You can't touch that. That's just who they are, right? They had the willpower, they didn't have the willpower, they're just super motivated. What we're saying here is yes, but also no. These are biological processes, these are metabolic processes, and maybe most importantly, there are things that we can do to bias them towards the things that we care about. If there's one takeaway I would just put forth, it's that blaming people for how they think, act, and feel does not make much sense when you consider it from the context of the biochemistry, the biology of the brain. You don't blame somebody because their knee hurts and say, oh, stop having your knee hurt. I don't want to hear about this anymore. Just fix it. But when somebody feels low, when somebody is making poor decisions, when somebody is having issues with their brains, we think to ourselves, oh, that's just them. That's who they are. That's their identity. I think it's very dangerous because it allows us to bypass the conversation of empathy. What could we do differently? How could we work with this person on biology rather than on only psychology? All right, let's talk about mood disorders. As it relates to depression, you may have seen books, articles, mood kind of centric stuff on the interaction between metabolism and mental health. I would say from my reading, it seems still unlikely that glucose is the primary driver of depression. And it comes back to the earlier point I made, which is trying to pick one thing and saying this is it, whether it's serotonin or glucose, just doesn't seem to make sense in the context of what we know about how our bodies work. So while there's always going to be a desire to say, well, if it's not serotonin, then it's insulin resistance, I don't think that's exactly what's happening here. What I do think is happening is that this is a multi-tiered, multifaceted kind of scenario that develops in our brains that we happen to call depression. We happen to go through the SIGI caps and say, well, you've met 5 of these for 2 weeks, depression. That doesn't actually tell you what's going on from a biological perspective. It's not sensitive enough to actually describe what pathways are being activated or deactivated. And a good example of this is we know that for a certain subset of people, that inflammation leads to symptoms of depression. That if you take a healthy person, inject them with lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin, put it in their bloodstream, they will feel depressed. Is that everyone? No. But it also helps to explain why certain people who have chronic inflammatory conditions have a much higher rate of developing major depression. Again, it doesn't mean that everyone who has inflammation will develop depression. It doesn't mean everyone with depression has high levels of inflammation. We do know, however, that one of the core kind of breakthroughs in our appreciation of what is driving depression pathophysiology is the role of the brain's resident immune cells, microglial cells. If you're looking for a way to explain these to patients, to other people as to why they matter, 10% of your brain cells are microglial cells. This isn't like a trivial, there's 1 or 2 in there. There's actually so many that they're capable of performing this kind of network-wide sensing of what's happening within your brain, looking for danger, looking for data that should make them change what they're doing as a way of maintaining brain homeostasis. We know that microglial state, meaning the activation of microglial cells, could be a central driver of brain inflammation. One of the big questions that comes up is, well, how does inflammation get from the bloodstream into the brain? Isn't there a block there? Well, yes and kind of no. I mean, there are parts of the blood that are more permeable, so things can get through. But also, these microglial cells are literally there to pick up data from the periphery and from the brain and translate that into action. So the second you start getting any sort of LPS or whatever it might be that's able to sneak through that blood-brain barrier, or maybe it's not even that, maybe it's binding to the blood-brain barrier, translating across into signals, the microglial cells say, hey, I need to do something about this. They are sensing for what is happening in the environment. And here's where I think the rubber meets the road for this conversation, is that microglial cells appear to be largely driven, as far as activation state, by metabolic products. So metabolism basically educates microglial cells. Microglial cells, in essence, determine brain neuroinflammatory state.
Hi, this is Chang He coming to you from Chicago. I practice in La Crosse, Wisconsin at Telos Functional and Integrated Medicine. Great event this weekend. Big topic for us at the clinic will be the glycocalyx, the impact of that, not just on cardiovascular, but cardiometabolic health. And then just had an awesome talk on nitric oxide and the impact on just about every single system that we work on and deal with, and hopefully help for people to recover in our small practice. So as it builds onto our practice, this is solid gold information. Just so glad. Maybe we'll see you in the future. Come join us at some point in time later. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Dr. Navaz Habib from Toronto, Ontario. I am a chiropractor and a functional medicine practitioner. I've been practicing for about 7 years now, and my specialty is in helping patients identify vagus nerve dysfunction and help them improve the function of their vagus nerve. One of my favorite tools that I recommend to all practitioners and every patient that comes in is to check their breathing, and to do this on a regular basis. I'll have my patients put one hand on their chest, one hand on their belly, and take a deep breath in. And ideally let that breath be through the nose. And what we're noticing is oftentimes people are breathing with their chest, they're breathing with their diaphragm not functioning very well, they're breathing using their accessory breathing muscles. This is often why people have really difficult time breathing and tight muscles in their traps and upper back. And so they're using the wrong muscles when they're breathing. And that's sending a signal to the brain that they're in a sympathetic state, not a parasympathetic state. So I have them do some deep belly breathing and have that feedback mechanism of their hand on their belly and ensure that the belly is going in and out with their breathing. And if we can, slow down that exhale. So a really interesting thing that was brought up by Dr. Saxena at this event was 4-7-8 breathing. 4 seconds in through the nose, 7-second hold, and 8-second exhale. And that's a really wonderful way, because when we're inhaling, we're activating the sympathetic nervous system. When we're exhaling, we're activating the parasympathetic nervous system. Something that I've used with my patients for a long time, but definitely links to the event today, and it was a really great time to share that information. So deep belly breathing, 4-7-8, wonderful, wonderful tool.
All right, I am here with Dr. Jill Valerius. We first met each other, I think 10 years ago. Dr. Valerius was a primary care doctor in a town of 6,000 people in Alaska, looking at functional medicine and seeing how it could work out. And I just wanted to, to take a moment just to share with everyone at home, like, what does the practice look like now, and a bit about the journey.
Yeah, so the practice now is a membership-based practice. I started family medicine with my own spin of functional medicine on it. So 4 years ago I transitioned, and it's really made a huge difference for patients and myself. We really get to know our patients and know them really well, and it also gives us time with patients, and which is the most important thing, as we know, and that's kind of the biggest challenge probably impacting functional medicine, is having time. And so with a membership model and a small model, I'm able to use time, and it's really made a difference in helping change lives and really just change the practice, and to be able to demonstrate what medicine could look like, more proactive model, and it's been really fun.
Well, what advice would you have for other doctors that may be in the process of trying to work out their transition and are feeling frustrated?
Yeah, I think, for people to say, oh, I can't do it because I'm in this small area, I've done this in a small area. I had some help doing that and making the transition. But if it's something you really want to do, do it. Worst case scenario, it's not working, you can go back to doing what you're doing. But I think it's really good. I did not go the route of transitioning into programs and then a membership. I just went straight into a membership model, and it's been really good.
Well, I just want to acknowledge your journey, because when I was getting started, you were there trying to work it out, and we've seen each other so many times over the years, and I'm just really happy to hear that it's successful, you're happy, and you're able to practice on your own terms and falling back in love with medicine. That's what it's all about. All right.
Thanks, James.
Come and join us here, the evolution of medicine. Doctors like Jill Valerius making it happen in Alaska. You can make it wherever you are too. So our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Boham. She works at Dr. Mark Hyman's Ultra Wellness Center and is an incredible communicator on the topics of cardiometabolic health, insulin sensitivity, and we sat down with her for this interview. Enjoy. All right, we are here at PLMI with Dr. Elizabeth Boham. Now, if you haven't checked out our podcast from a few months ago on non-acute fatty liver disease, I highly recommend it because there's so many themes that go across all types of patient care. But Doc, I really appreciate your talk here at the conference, and you couldn't really have a conference on cardiometabolic health without talking about insulin. And one of the things that is in common with what you shared here today and non-acute fatty liver disease is that people don't know they have it. So, you know, for the doctors that are out there that are seeing the patients that are in sort of like those early stages, what are some of the best ways that you've seen to sort of get ahead of this and help patients understand where they're headed if they don't do something?
Yeah, so, you know, it's important that we really look at the whole patient when we're meeting with them and get a really good sense of what their nutrition assessment is. So we want to look at waist-to-hip ratio. If that's elevated, then we've got to think about insulin resistance. We've got to look at some biomarkers like fasting insulin, of course the liver function tests. So if they're elevated, you've got to be thinking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which you know, unfortunately is affecting 25% or higher, maybe even 30-some% of the adult population, which is crazy. So we've got to be looking for it. You know, we then look for other biomarkers such as particle size testing in our cholesterol to look for signs of insulin resistance, because you get a lot of good clues as to does somebody have insulin resistance when we're looking at particle size testing. Of course, we look at physical exam findings. There's a lot of physical exam findings that can indicate insulin resistance is going on, even beyond that waist-to-hip ratio. So acanthosis nigricans or skin tags or changes in hair growth patterns, you know, all can give us a sense of does this patient have insulin resistance.
Yeah. What would you say, like, obviously, as this functional medicine movement matures, right, you have specialists in different areas. You might have cardiologists who are coming into the fray and you know, beyond primary care and family medicine. What are some of the ways that you found that, you know, functional medicine can build relationships with our conventional colleagues who haven't quite got there yet, and which out of this is the most accessible to them?
So, I mean, I think that functional medicine is just really a different way of thinking about things, and it really just makes sense. And I think that conventional medicine doctors aren't against functional medicine. They just need to understand where we're coming from and say, sort of, okay, we want to just think about this patient a little bit differently than we were originally instructed. Conventional medicine does an amazing job at acute care medicine in this country, I think, but what we're missing out on is chronic disease management, and we really need a different model to help do that. And I think functional medicine is really working to build that model, so we can, it's really good to bring both together. So we just do really good all over medicine.
Now this weekend, obviously, you know, it's been cardiometabolic focused, but you've also had, you know, the opportunity to watch all these other presenters. How has that sort of expanded your worldview on this niche?
Oh yeah, so, you know, we just had this great conversation about nitric oxide production and how to support that, which is, you know, really good information to help us know, okay, what else can we do to help our patients? And when you've got somebody with high blood pressure, for example, and, you know, you're trying all the normal things and it's not really, you're not getting as much improvement as you would like to with lifestyle or even some of the original supplements, it's really great to think about things in a different way. So it's been really, it's been great to hear all this new information as well.
All right, well, Dr. Boham did an amazing talk on insulin, and we've got some of the best bits from that coming up. Enjoy.
So this is my last case that I wanted to finish up on. This is a 30-year-old woman who came to see me with weight gain and hair loss. She has been overweight her whole life, and she has a sister who has the same situation. Struggled with her weight her whole life. She was diagnosed with PCOS at age 17, and then throughout the years, she was placed on many different medications to help manage it. From metformin to birth control pills, that did help to stabilize the androgenic hair loss, but then over the years, to help with her weight, she was placed on metformin, and then Victoza, and then Adderall, not for attention issues, but for weight. And so she really came to me because she wanted to do this a different way. You know, she wanted to say, okay, how else can I really help improve my metabolism? And you know, she definitely had significant stress early in life, and she had a lot of digestive issues, gas, bloating, some constipation. When we look at her ABCDs, she's been working really, she works really hard from a lifestyle perspective. So she, think about that running against the wind. She works really hard lifestyle-wise, but she is overweight. Her waist-hip ratio is high. She did have some male pattern hair loss, and when you look at her diet and lifestyle journals, she really struggles at nighttime with the carbs and the sugar. And we did a sleep study, because I often do in situations, or when I want to rule it out. She is also negative. All three of my cases, they had negative sleep studies, which is not very common, honestly. I have a lot of insulin resistance is related to sleep apnea, but her liver functions were mildly elevated. Her hemoglobin A1C was normal, but look at her uric acid. I had to write high next to it, but you guys didn't even need that. You know that greater than 5.5 is considered too high. Her insulin was 6, and she had a normal HOMA-IR score. I told you she's been working really hard from the lifestyle perspective. Her particle size testing was pretty good, but look at that LH level, so of 19, that's that LH hypersecretion that you see. And her androgens were okay. We did check glyphosate, which was high. We did check glutathione, which was low. And her oxidative stress markers weren't actually high on testing, but genetically, this was an area where she had increased risk. So I found this fascinating because, again, remember I told you she had some gut issues, some gas, some bloating, some constipation. And this is okay, we have got to pay attention to this. She's got very high lipopolysaccharide antibodies, which can indicate that she has some increased intestinal permeability, right? Because they have to get across the barrier to create these antibodies. So it's indicating increased intestinal permeability, but also makes me say I've got to focus on the gut, which is, of course, what we did. We did the 5R program. I gave her some herbal antibacterial agents, but really focused on the prebiotics and probiotics and glutamine. I picked a special probiotic strain that may help with blood sugar regulation, and we did the MitoFood plan with a ketogenic option. I gave her a supplement that had some tart cherry, but also luteolin and quercetin to help lower uric acid, and EGCG, because that EGCG from green tea can improve insulin sensitivity and have some anti-androgenic effect. We used inositol, since that can help with PCOS, and sulforaphane, I love. It's one of my favorite supplements, right? It's a glucoraphanin with maracinase to help produce sulforaphane, which helps improve glutathione production, and omega-3 fats, because you could consider some anti-androgenic herbs, but again, not everybody wants the whole kitchen sink thrown in. We got to remember to ask them how many supplements are okay. We really focused on lowering her toxic load, increasing her regularity of exercise and stress management. And one of the things just to focus on in terms of stress management, I thought this was a really interesting study looking at how the beneficial effect of acupuncture in patients with PCOS. And there may be multiple reasons why this works, but one may be in terms of its impact on stress. But it can help improve BMI and the HOMA-IR score, which is interesting. So I want to just conclude with this insulin resistance. You want to look, so then you'll find it. You want to catch it early whenever possible, because of course it's easier to reverse when you pick it up early. The power of the ABCDs of nutrition assessment, I just want to highlight that because it can help organize your thoughts and what you see. Remember, you want to personalize your approach because sometimes we want to throw in the kitchen sink on everybody, but it's really important to personalize your approach so it's easier for our patients to be compliant. And so think about for them, what are their triggers? Where on their imbalances do you need to focus? Is it more toxins? Is it more the microbiome? Is it more lifestyle? And really express that to them. Try to work to identify the best food plan for your patient by getting a sense of what they've done in the past, what they've been successful with, and how willing they are to make changes. And really, you're focusing on improving that metabolic flexibility. And then lastly, we're focusing on getting away from the scale, because that can be not always giving you that right information, and really thinking about these biomarkers and the waist-hip ratio as great ways to track your patients and see their improvement. Because you know what, a lot of times before you see what they want to see on the scale, right? Before you see big changes on the scale, you're going to see great changes in terms of their biomarkers and even the waist-to-hip ratio. So it was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
All right, so one of our key sponsors at the Functional Forum is the Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center. And one of the reasons is because whatever type of practice you're running, you're going to have to do patient education. And starting all of those resources from scratch is a lot of work and shouldn't be done by every practitioner. So as part of this, you can see there's the Cardiometabolic in-practice guide. So there's tons of great tools there on implementation, patient education. You got the group visit toolkit, which a lot of practitioners use, that has all the PowerPoints and education materials that you can adapt for your practice. But come and check this out here. So, I mean, if you think about cardiometabolic health, you got blood pressure, polycystic ovary syndrome, atherosclerosis, NAFLD. You know, these are all topics that patients may come in with. And how are you going to build an education program for each of these different factors of cardiometabolic health? This is just one niche in medicine. So having these kind of tools is available. The membership from Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center makes it easy for you to get all those resources. So check out goevomed.com/LMRC. You can follow the link below. Check out the next segment. I'm here with Tina Musselman, one of the first Practice Accelerator graduates. You know, I know this has been an interesting, journey for you here, but tell us a little bit about the practice as it is today.
Sure. I'm on my 4th restarting of the practice. I was in hospital administration. I was a regional director, and I started and stopped my private practice. When I enrolled in Practice Accelerator, it was probably my 3rd startup. But through the pandemic, I lost family, I moved, and I ended up with a bad case of what I now know is burnout. Yeah. I didn't know it was burnout at the time, and I texted my husband and said, I'm done. I quit. You can leave me. We will split the savings. We'll share the kids, but I'm not doing this anymore. And I quit the next day. So now I'm a year in. Yep. I'm a year into my private practice, have a vision and a really big mission, and just so grateful to be here and using all the skills and tools that I've gained over the years, and everything from the Practice Accelerator.
Well, I just want to share, my congratulations to you. I know making it into private practice is not easy, and I just want to acknowledge, all the effort that you've done to do it, and then coming out this last time, getting straight into it and making it work.
It's nice having people to talk to because not too many people are in this space. Yeah. So it's good seeing other people's stories, hearing what they're doing. It gives you motivation, because for so long I would just look out my window and be upset that I wasn't doing it. Yeah. And it just festered and festered, but it's nice to have people to lean on, really.
Great to see practitioners of all variety having success, transitioning to functional medicine, falling back in love with medicine. Check out the next segment. So one of the things I love about the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute conference is the way that they organize the content. And typically what you see is that in the first half of the day, they get really deep into the science. So this morning we had Dr. Austin Perlmutter, we had Dr. David Perlmutter, we had Dr. Elizabeth Boham. But towards the end of the day, typically bring in practitioners and doctors who are really well versed in implementing this and taking it from the sort of heady science and into practical application. And Dr. Shilpa Saxena is one of the best in the business at that, and so we caught up with her about the implementation of these ideas into everyday practice. Enjoy. So one of the reasons I love coming to the PLMI conference is that there is always a stacked amount of science early on in the session, but then there's always some practical implementation later, and normally that job is given here to Dr. Shilpa Saxena. And Doc, you did an amazing job today in contextualizing cardiometabolic health and what you have to do. I wanted to ask you, some of the things that you shared there is, having worked with so many patients, what do you think are the keys to getting people to take their very first steps into implementation?
I think the biggest key is having the patient be aware that they can do something. If you think about the traditional medical experience, what they've been used to is going into a provider's office, and then the provider kind of scans records, asks them a few cursory questions, and then nails them with orders or recommendations. They don't really participate in the decision making. Mm-hmm. So I think it's essential in a functional medicine relationship that you actually invite the patient into the decision-making process. And then, as I jokingly say, the more that the plan is the idea of the patient or seems to be originating and prioritized based on the patient's understanding of what they'll do, the more likely it'll actually happen. Yeah. And then if it happens, then they think you're the magic when they really were the magic in the first place.
Absolutely. So what are some of the strategies you use to get them involved at that level of decision making?
It's really important for me to shift power at the front end of the visit. So I shift it from me, which is the perceived power in the room, and then I make sure I do things like ask permission. Is it okay if we do this next? What do you think about that? I ask them their opinion, and then I acknowledge whenever they give me some intuitive remark about, like, I don't think that exercise is what helps me. I'll acknowledge it after they give me a reason. I'll say, oh yeah, that makes sense. I can understand why you wouldn't think exercise is it. So as I'm doing that, I am shifting power and I'm building up self-efficacy and empowerment in the patient. Then at the natural ending of the visit, when we have a care plan that is in many ways derived from what they have said they can and will do, they will 100% of the time buy everything that we discussed and or be excited about the handout because it really was generated in partnership, not as labs do this.
Yeah, well, that is the therapeutic partnership in action. You know, during this conference, Dr. Saxena did an amazing job of contextualizing the information and giving practitioners like you the starting points on how to really implement that. Here's some of the best bits from her talk. Enjoy.
Sleep apnea. Screen for this. I feel like Liz talked about this in great detail, and I think it's super important. I think we kind of float over this, but a simple Epworth sleepiness scale, home sleep study. So many people are averse because they think it's gonna, they don't want to do the test because they're just gonna end up with the Darth Vader nighttime experience. But there is so much more available, dental devices that are available. And this is a game changer when people are ready to be diagnosed and take on the machinery. The one thing that I will ask you to consider in my clinical pearl is a lot of people are super like, yes, let's do it for the first 90 days. And then slowly it might taper off. And if you don't ask, at 6 months in, hey, are you still using your CPAP? How's it going for you? I'm surprised at how many people have just like, oh yeah, I think I got better, so it was bothering me, it was drying out my nose, and they kind of come up with the reasons for why it doesn't work for them, and then they drop off, and then you're wondering why the metabolic dysfunction isn't correcting. And you're under the assumption they're still using their CPAP. So I think for CPAP patients, really important to keep accountability over time. Okay, diet. Biggest impact today. Okay, this is my approach to diet. I think it's super important to ask them what they're willing to do and what they think would be the biggest impact for that day. So if they think decreasing sugar is the goal, that's my goal. Even if I wanted them to go on an elimination diet, if that's what they come in with and they're really passionate about, that's what we start with. If I really do want them to do the elimination diet and I say, would you be open for me to give you this handout and schedule a coaching visit in case you nail the sugar thing and you're ready to take it to the next level? If you think that they're ready to do that, give them that. But I think early wins, I keep saying this. When I work with other providers, they're always wondering, I don't do all the fancy functional medicine. I will tell you, I don't do fancy functional medicine. I do like functional medicine 101. And I think I get great results because I actually do very little of the thinking. I really just am good at connecting with people and asking them empowering the person, and they come up with their plan. And then I just support the heck out of that. And somehow they do well. Like I don't generally have to get them to specialists and stuff like that because they take care of themselves. I really do believe that. I think many of us are almost afraid to let them have their choices and their power. Not that we don't want them to have it, but we're just such in a position of being the power in the room. Like we think that's our job, like it's my job to be the authority and know what to do right now, and so I will tell you what to do. I invite you to consider backing off and I even say, like, I even do the Captain Stubing thing. I'm like, you might think I'm Captain Stubing, but really, we're gonna meet here as a partnership, and the goal is you're gonna know that you're Captain Stubing. And when they get that, they're unstoppable. So the other thing that I remember is sometimes it's a matter of the simple question of, like, are you willing to remove something, or are you willing to add something? Are you willing to add vegetables, or are you willing to remove sugary drinks? Keep it simple, sibling. Don't try to, oh, let me show you ketogenic with the MitoFlex, with the intermittent fasting. Absolutely get to that place at some point. But consider visit 1 or when they're not in ventral vagal tone to not try to do too much, because if they're not in ventral vagal tone, that's a lot. I mean, just think of yourself. How often can you get away with doing that kind of stuff if you're not in a good place with your mess? Yeah? I don't know, like I told you. Me, gluten, Italy, and France, it's never worked. Okay, my theory is if I'm good 90% of the time, 95% of the time, then I should have the metabolic reserves to do gluten on vacation. Okay, fasting. Liz did a wonderful job explaining this. I think fasting is a F word for some people, so be careful. And some people love it, right? So Unwell Ellen may have read an article about it, and I leverage what she's excited about. One of the things that I'm conscious of with cardiometabolic patients is that they don't caloric restrict so much that they create hypoglycemic states that put them in, this kind of reactive hyperglycemia. Do you know what I'm talking about? When they kind of, they get hypoglycemic, and then their liver is like, you know what, that's too low. Let me dump a bunch of sugar, and then they get they're getting jitters not just from the low, but the secondary emergency high. Have you ever met someone who says, I don't understand why my morning sugar is high, my evening sugar was 123, and then I didn't eat anything, and then why am I 220 in the morning? It could be they're not eating enough. So fasting, like I tried to do the 16-8 intermittent fasting, and my lipid profiles worsened. But when I do 14-10, that works for me because I'm not triggering that hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia switch. Yeah, so it's not like people who are 16-8 are better than people who are 12-12. 12-12 is sufficient for intermittent fasting. Faith-based incentive. I think it's kind of interesting. You will, if you ask about if you do a spiritual history, there are many people who would love to use their faith as a behavior modification tool. It's like they want to be closer to their faith, and certain parts of their faith would request for them to do fasting or to go without this. And that, I think that's cool to leverage that. That's like a 2-for-1 special too. Sustainability, we talked about early wins. Layered approach, I don't recommend starting with the complex stuff first. I really do think the early win with something simple is great. You add on complexities. And then flexibilities for life stage. I mean, if you have a celiac patient, there's less flexibility allowed for gluten, for example. But my children, they were 4 and 2 when I started functional medicine. I know, right? Poor them. And good for them in the same instance. But of course, I evaluated all their food allergies and sensitivities early. I found out this one's allergic to chocolate and chicken and raspberries, and this one was gluten and da-da-da-da. So when we went to birthday parties, I was not the mother that was loved by my children. Like, why can't we have pizza? And I was like, here's your gluten-free, dairy-free, nut-free pizza. And, at that stage, when we actually eliminated my daughter's foods, she grew 2 inches over one summer. And I had relative control over them at that stage. Yes, and I know that person laughing has teenagers or more. So then enter teenagers, and these girls were smart. Like, they saw the association. But at the teenager level, they had wanted nothing to do with mom's wackadoo science. There were Cheez-Its in my daughter's bathroom. Like, I went in to go clean her bathroom, there's a box of Cheez-Its sitting near the toilet bowl. I'm like, this is bad. Like, if you're hiding your Cheez-Its by the toilet bowl. But instead of getting mad at her, you know, I was like, okay, I get it. Like, this is your drug right now. And then when she would have a tantrum or of some sort, and I knew it was a gluten-mediated tantrum because I remember it from when she was younger, we just, you know, I'd, oh, what do you think could cause this? You know, and I didn't say it as sarcastically as I'm saying it right now. And she would say, like, I don't know, I'm so stressed, and maybe it's the gluten, you know, like in denial that she doesn't really want to believe that. And then now they're both college kids, and they are self-regulating. Mostly. But so I've got to meet patients where they are in their life stage. Yeah? I think it's important to give people grace that way. All right. So, synopsis, I think these things are important. And the more you can do little lever changes of diet, stress, and sleep, you get to affect comorbidities. So just know that these are some of the things you look at. I'm going to be talking about how this all plays a role in physiology. You're going to be learning about the glycocalyx. So remember that physical is important, psychological, and just self-efficacy is just as important. And then I remind you that all you can do is do your best, and then please, please, please trust the rest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Functional Forum. Next month, we will be at the Institute for Functional Medicine's annual international conference in Orlando. We'll be bringing you all the best bits. This is the year of reconnection, so wherever you are, wherever you're watching from, I hope that you can find a community of other practitioners to connect with. In the meantime, we'll be back from IFM next month, and we'll see you next time.